Welcome back to 25-Minute Physiology, where I try to demystify and simplify science to help you reach your fitness, performance, and training goals. Now, today's topic, I want to talk about fat, carbohydrates, fat loss, and performance. The reason I'm doing this is because I had the pleasure of being on Joe Rogan's podcast yesterday, and this topic came up a little bit, but I kicked myself as I left because we didn't really clarify the situation. Sometimes I forget how important and necessary it is for us to go back to the very beginning, lay the foundation so that we really understand what we're talking about. If you promise to give me these next 20 or so minutes, I guarantee you'll leave with more clarity about what carbs are and what fat are. Are they bad for you? Are they good? Than you've ever had before. I know that's a bold statement, but we think we can get there. So let's start at the very, very basics, and that's how fat loss occurs. Right? Well, what most of us don't really realize is it's very simple. It's simply through breathing. You can go check out my 55-minute physiology of fat loss video if you want more information. But basically what happens is you inhale oxygen. You exhale carbon dioxide. The difference is, of course, carbon. Where that carbon comes from is your own internal body. What most folks don't realize is your fat is a long chain of carbon. So here's what happens. You do something like exercise, and you create a demand or a need for energy. The way you generate cellular energy is to break molecular bonds. So if your fat is a long chain of carbons that are put together with chemical bonds, and you come along and you break one of those bonds, like that released energy. In this particular case, it's a net positive resultant energy. You use that energy to then power the exercise. But you've got a free-floating carbon that is now wasted. In order to process that, you take a big gulp of air in, breathe in oxygen, combine that with that free-floating carbon to make carbon dioxide, then exhale and rid yourself of that carbon dioxide. Now, since your fat was a long chain of carbon and you broke one of those carbons off and it's now gone back to the atmosphere as waste, the length of your carbon chain got shorter and shorter and shorter. This is literally how you lose fat. Now, plants are a little bit the opposite. So a plant breathes in CO2 and breathes out O2. They use light as their energy source because they don't have the ability to make energy like we do, or, well, to be more honest, we don't have the ability to make energy the way they do. But they use a process called photosynthesis. So they bring in carbon dioxide, of course add water, and that light is used to power the synthesis process of putting together carbon dioxide molecules. So really they're going the exact opposite of what we do. We breathe in O2, breathe out CO2 to get rid of our stored carbon. They are breathing in CO2 so that they can extract that carbon and get rid of the oxygen back into the atmosphere. Well, it turns out a carbohydrate is simply a carbon that has been added to a water molecule, or that has been hydrated. So the basic molecular structure of a carbohydrate is a chain of carbons. Sound familiar? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons. 6 carbons attached to 6 water molecules. Right? So C6H12O6. That in particular is the structure of what's called glucose or fructose. Now, those are 2 of your 3 monosaccharides. So a simple sugar is one of those sugar molecules. The third one, of course, is galactose. Now, when a plant does that breathe in CO2, breathe out O2 thing, they're making either glucose or fructose, simple sugars. If you combine 2 or more monosaccharides, so in this case, it wouldn't matter if it's 2 glucose or 1 glucose, 1 fructose, or 2 fructose, or 1 glucose, 1 galactose, doesn't matter. But anytime you put 2 monosaccharides together, you get what's called a disaccharide. Now, in the case of plants, what they're usually doing is forming initially either glucose or fructose, they combine those together, and that's what we call sucrose. So it's a disaccharide with one fructose, one glucose. And the reason they do that is because glucose is extremely metabolically sensitive or active in plants and humans. In other words, if a cell finds glucose, it's going to use it for metabolism. So plants have a problem when they need to transport glucose back and forth throughout its own body system or its body, because if it puts too much glucose in the system, it's going to get absorbed up and it won't get to its target. A great example is how we make fruit. So a plant will go through this process, generate glucose and fructose. It'll combine them together to make sucrose, put that in its little bloodstream, if you will, send it around to, say, the fruit part of the plant, break it back down into glucose and fructose. The fructose stays around, and the glucose then either gets burned as metabolism or gets stored as starch. This is why fruits are actually full of fructose, but things like potatoes or root vegetables are more like starch because they never go through this fructose process. Also, why the longer a fruit sits and the longer it goes, the riper it gets, because the more fructose is converted. And fructose is like 5 to 6 times sweeter than glucose, all right, for a variety of reasons. Now, when it does this process, it gets left with its glucose or its fructose. We then come along and say, okay, we don't have this magical ability to generate or synthesize carbons into a carbohydrate using light as a power. So what we have to do to make up for that is we have to then consume these foods. All right, so we still inhale our oxygen, we ingest water, we eat fructose and starches to get our carbohydrate, and that's how we power our exercise. We then exhale carbon dioxide as our waste product, which, funny enough, goes back into the atmosphere and is, of course, reabsorbed by the plant. This is our magic circle of life, right? So we're just continuing to shift carbon back and forth and moving it around from the plant to you and plant and back. Now that we understand the basics, let's move over to application. All right, now, a lot of people have heard carbohydrates, but there's real confusion about, are they good for me? Are they bad for me? But wait, sugar's bad for me, but carbs are good? Or no, wait, is it the opposite? What are starch? I don't know. So here are the basics of what carbohydrates mean. Most of the time, this is split into 3 categories. There are some other carbs, but this is what we're going to focus on. Now, most of the time when we say sugar, what we're referring to is one of these monosaccharides, right? A simple sugar is also almost synonymous with a monosaccharide. And it's simple because it's easy to metabolize. So if you were to put a straight shot of simple sugar in you or in a plant, it gets metabolized very quickly. Remember, this is the reason we had to make sucrose, or the plant has to do it. The downside of it, though, is it can't be moved around. So when we ingest our sugar or a monosaccharide or our simple sugar, what people tend to say is actually starch is better for you because it takes a lot longer to break down. What we have to understand is it's not a good or a bad, right? There's pros and cons to both approaches, but that's basically what a starch is, which is our second type of carbohydrate. It is a bunch of monosaccharides that have been packed together really densely. But because they've been smashed together, they don't break down as fast. They're actually released slower into your bloodstream. So if you have a bolus of sugar or a bolus of starch, the sugar may make your blood spike really fast and crash back down, but the starch may be released slowly because it takes a lot longer to break down. Now, there are times when you want both, or times when the other is not effective. We'll have to discuss that in a later video. The third aspect or type of carbohydrates, rather, is fiber, right? So we'll have to do this in another video as well, but this is an important consideration. So when we talk about things like sucrose or sucralose or table sugar, one of the problems is not that sugar is bad for us, it doesn't hurt us or kill us, but when we ingest table sugar or added sugars or processed sugars, By the way, fun fact, I wasn't planning on going here, but just so you know, most sugar comes from beets or canes, and it's brown. And when they refine it all the way down, it turns white because the dark color is actually molasses. So they can use the molasses then and sell you the molasses, or they can distill that down and make brown sugar out of it. That's what those are. Anyways, when we ingest a bunch of added table sugar, it's not necessarily a problem, but it comes in the form of it comes in a non-natural form, which is to say you ingest a lot of sugar, but you don't get the fiber that's typically in plants. You also don't get any of the other vitamins and minerals or antioxidants that come with the fruit. In addition, we can also consume it at a super high concentration that we would never actually ingest it in the plant form. So it's not that it's bad for us, but it can lead to problems because of concentration issues and because it costs us important fiber and important vitamins and minerals. Starch, on the other hand, is generally not distilled down and put into packages, and so most of the time when we consume starch, it's coming in the form of a plant or vegetable, which is generally why people say starches are better for you. All right, but that's not necessarily true. So now that we understand what's going on here, let's complete our final picture. When you ingest that carbon then, the whole point was for you to store it, right? But it gets stored in a couple of different ways. Now, carbon, regardless of where it really came from, but we'll stick with carbohydrates first, is stored in one of three places. It's stored in your blood as blood sugar, right? So glucose and blood sugar are really the same thing. It's stored in your muscle or your liver as glycogen. Now, fun fact here, just like a plant stored its glucose as starch, a human stores its glucose as glycogen. So muscle glycogen and starch is really the same thing, depending on what animal it's in or what plant it's in. But that's where we store it. Now, any excess glucose or carbohydrate beyond what we need to have in our blood or beyond what we need in our liver or our muscle is then, of course, stored as extra fat. And if we remember the chemical structure of glucose or sugar being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbon molecules with 6 water, if we look at fat, we see it's very, very similar. So the stored form of fat is typically a triglyceride, which is 1, 2, 3 triglycerol. So it is a glycerol backbone, which is this 3-carbon chain. Glycerol meaning like glycogen and glucose and all those other sugars. 1, 2, 3 with 3 big long carbon chains. Now the length of this carbon chain, instead of being 6 carbons like glucose, it could be 12, 16, 18, maybe even more. Right? The length of the carbon chain determines what we call it. And these folks are fatty acids. If you've heard those things, so medium chain, short chain, long chain fatty acids, etc. If it's, say, 16 carbons, we give it a certain name. If it's 17 carbons, we call it a different type of fatty acid, and etc. By the way, there's actually some double bonds going on here. And if there's a single bond at a break at, say, the 3rd chain, we call that an omega-3 fatty acid. If that break happens at the 6th carbon, we call that omega-6, etc., etc. Just some fun stuff for another video, maybe. But my point is, it's still a big chain, long chain of carbons. So the ability, chemically, for us to convert from this type of chain of carbon to this chain of carbon is actually fairly easy. We have to stop thinking about fat and carbs as two things that are competing and they're against each other. They're complementary. Because of this, how much glucose can I possibly store in my muscle? Well, not very much relative to how much fat I can store. Right, my muscle is only so big, so my body's going to want to keep glycogen full in those areas. But the fat is the backup system. So the analogy I like to give is actually think of 2 gears on a bicycle. When one turns, it helps the other one turn. Now, in some situations, you might want the front gear to be a lot bigger than the back one, and some other situations it might be the inverse. Sometimes they're equal. That's sport specificity, right? But the point is, we don't want to compromise either one of them. You would never want to be like, oh, cut that back gear completely off. And that's one of the problems when we focus too much on going to one end or the other end of this metabolic spectrum, right? Which is another way of saying, if you force yourself so that you're an optimal fat burner, that could come at the compromise of being able to burn carbohydrates, and vice versa. Now, most of us are probably not very good at burning fat relative to carbohydrate, so it's maybe okay to emphasize improving your fat burning abilities. But nonetheless, we want to have this wonderful term that I wish I coined but I didn't, called metabolic flexibility. Especially for someone who's just interested in long-term health or a variety of physical activity or exercise, sport performance endeavors. Being able to use fat when it's appropriate and carbs when it's appropriate is far better than optimizing one over the other most of the time. And that's because of this. When you burn muscle glycogen or use sugar as a fuel, two things. Number one, it's coming from the muscle itself that's being exercised. So if you're doing a lot of quadricep exercise for whatever reason, doing sprints or hills or pushing a sled or whatever, you're burning the muscle glycogen in that quadricep muscle directly. Now the advantage is carbohydrates are more metabolically efficient per molecule of oxygen, and they're much faster because they're right there. The limitation, of course, is again, how much can we possibly store in my quad? So after a few minutes or seconds of hard exercise, that number starts going down. We then turn to fat and say, okay, fat, you're the backup system here. The advantage of fat is relative to the amount of carbohydrates in my body, I can store way more fat. But fat comes from the entire body, not from the exercising muscle per se. So I burn all the muscle glycogen in my quad, but when I start using fat as a fuel, that fat has to come from the entire body. It has to be broken down, mobilized, put into blood, uptaken into the muscle, uptaken into the cell, gone through the mitochondria, and finally utilized for fuel. So it's much slower. So both of these things have pros and cons. It's not like one or the other. We have to get that mindset out of our head for the vast majority of things that we're going to encounter. Outside of some extreme circumstances, we want to have the ability to go back and forth between them. This is why we have the biology to frickin' do it. Right? We wouldn't have it if it wasn't potential benefit to it. All right, so being able to go back and forth is really, really important. We have advantages for both of them. So from a practical perspective, think of it this way. My body really cares about maintaining the concentration of sugar in my blood for a variety of reasons, and it really cares about maintaining the amount of glycogen in my muscle and my liver, right? You always want that direct, quick supply of energy in case something drastic happened, you had to run, escape danger, or something like that. So if you do something that depletes your muscle glycogen, your body's going to do anything basically at all costs to replete it as fast as possible. But fat is really the backup system, right? It doesn't really care the amount of fat, with the exception of it getting very, very, very low. I mean, think about this. The vast majority of us have a very similar muscle glycogen concentration, but we have wild differences in the amount of fat that we store. It's backup. So when you do a really hard bout of exercise, really high intensity intervals, maybe some heavy strength training, but you have to take a lot of volume, you burn that muscle glycogen. Well, under normal circumstances, since this conversion is so easy, you're going to actually convert your fat. You'll start breaking down your fat to replace your muscle glycogen. So in this case, it doesn't really particularly matter if you're burning fat as your fuel or carbs as your fuel during the exercise. In either case, you will lose your fat. So if we put this together, hopefully the wheels are churning in your head. What's the best type of exercise to then do if you're interested in fat loss? Well, the obvious answer is it doesn't particularly matter. Do the one that you like the most. Do the one that you're going to work the hardest at, that you'll do the most frequently. That's more important than anything. Advantages of high-intensity exercise, intervals, things like that, hey, they burn a lot of muscle glycogen. That's good for you metabolically. There's also advantage of doing more of your traditional steady-state cardio. So my general recommendation is do both. If you're just the average person and you don't have maybe a goal or a competition in mind, maybe once a week do some steady-state cardio, maybe once a week do some intervals, choose the bike, choose the air assault bike or Airdyne bike, choose a rower, do circuit training, go do hot yoga, anything you want. Do a combination of things because all of it is going to result in you doing what? It gets you to ventilate more, right? All you're really doing with all this stuff is tricking yourself into burning more energy. That's all you're trying to do. So don't get bogged down in the details of the intensity of the exercise, do a combination of them. Now, from the diet perspective, what's better then? High carb, low fat, low carb, high fat? Again, I won't say that it doesn't matter at all, but it doesn't matter in a lot of cases. If you're 60% fat or carbs or 40 or 30, as long as your total carbon intake is lower than the carbons you're exhaling, you're going to lose fat. And if you do this with good nutrition, vegetables, plants, animals, good fats, proteins, things like this, you should be able to lose fat while not losing too much muscle mass. Be careful of fat loss schemes that don't pay attention or tell you about what happens to muscle mass. Right? So some poor nutrition plans may help you lose fat, but you'll also lose a lot of muscle, and that's not beneficial either. So any standard routine, it doesn't particularly matter. If you want to go low carb, fine. Right? Make sure though that you're not doing low vegetable, because then you won't get all the vitamins and minerals and nutrients, or you won't have all the fiber. This is a major problem with those that go on low carbohydrate diets, especially if they're cutting out other fruits and vegetables. So be careful of that. It can be done, but just be careful. If you want to go on a high carbohydrate or moderate carbohydrate diet, hey, that's fine too. Your body's not that precious. It doesn't care that much. There's a lot of other implications to these diets, but for general health, for general performance and fitness, you have a lot more flexibility and plasticity between these two than most people want to acknowledge. So I hope that helped clear up some confusion. I'm sure I'll do many more videos on the topics or others. If you have any suggestions of where you'd like me to go, please feel free to comment. If not, I get this question a lot, but this video or any of the videos I post on my website, you're absolutely welcome to use them for your own purposes. I get a lot of professors that want to use these for class. Please do so. Of course, I appreciate you just crediting me back and not stealing them and taking them on your own. But I make these so that you share the information. That's what's important. If you like this video, you can check out more of them on my website. You can see them up on YouTube. They're around. Those of you that listen to the episode with Joe Rogan, I hope this helped clarify. I'll send this to him and see if he'll watch it, and maybe I'll have him back on and we'll cover it in more detail. But for now, again, thank you all for your support, and we'll catch you next time.